Jessica Morgan, 32, stood frozen as her mother's words echoed through the crowded living room. "You'll always be a burden, just like you've been your entire life." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her, a mixture of shock, pity, and uncomfortable curiosity. In that moment, something inside Jessica finally snapped. 15 years of calculated tolerance transformed into ice-cold clarity. She wouldn't just walk away this time. Her mother had no idea what was coming. Hey everyone, before I dive deeper into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you're enjoying family drama stories like this one, hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more tales of family betrayal, unexpected revenge, and the complicated web of relationships we call family. Now, let's get back to the moment my entire family dynamic changed forever. My childhood looked picture-perfect from the outside. Our colonial-style home in Connecticut had manicured lawns, and my mother, Eleanor Morgan, was the epitome of suburban sophistication. She volunteered for every PTA event, hosted elegant dinner parties, and maintained a reputation as a devoted mother. My father, James, was a successful investment banker who spent most of his time at the office, leaving my upbringing primarily in my mother's hands. From an early age, I was trained to be an extension of my mother's carefully constructed image. Piano lessons, ballet classes, straight A's, nothing was ever enough. "Jessica, your posture is atrocious," she'd whisper at social gatherings. "Jessica, that dress makes you look heavier than you already are," she'd comment before family photos. "Jessica, do you really think Yale will accept someone who only got a 96 on their calculus exam?" she'd ask when I proudly showed her my test results. I internalized her criticisms, believing I truly was the disappointment she painted me to be. I spent my teenage years trying desperately to earn her approval, thinking if I could just be perfect enough, she'd finally love me the way she loved my younger brother, Michael. He was the golden child, the son who could do no wrong, even when he crashed her car or failed classes. "Boys will be boys," she'd say with an indulgent smile, while I was held to impossibly high standards. By the time I turned 18, I'd been accepted to Princeton, not Yale, as my mother had wanted, which she made sure to mention at every opportunity. Jessica got into Princeton. Not Yale, unfortunately, but Princeton will have to do. I was pre-med, just as she had planned for me since I was 10 years old, despite my passion for literature and writing. During my sophomore year of college, I collapsed during finals week. The doctors diagnosed me with exhaustion and anxiety so severe that I needed to be hospitalized for 3 days. When my mother visited, she didn't ask how I was feeling. Instead, she said, "I hope you realize how embarrassing this is for our family. Your father had to cancel an important meeting to be here." That hospital stay was my first small rebellion. Against my mother's wishes, I switched my major from pre-med to English literature. The phone call where I told her was the first time I heard the word that would haunt me for years to come: "You've always been such a burden, Jessica. Now you're throwing away your future to read books. Your father and I didn't sacrifice everything to raise a failure." Despite her disapproval, I thrived in my new major. I graduated with honors and was offered a position at a prestigious publishing house in New York City. At my graduation dinner, my mother raised her glass and said, to Jessica, who finally managed to finish something she started. The table fell silent, but no one challenged her, least of all me. I moved to New York, determined to put some distance between my mother and myself. I began therapy, started making real friends for the first time, and slowly built a life that felt like my own. I dated, though relationships were difficult. Years of my mother's criticism had left me with the belief that I was fundamentally unlovable. For years into my career, I met David. He was kind, supportive, and saw through the walls I'd built around myself. "You flinch every time you make a decision," he observed during our third date. "Like you're waiting for someone to criticize you." His perception was startling and healing. With David, I began to understand what healthy love looked like. We moved in together after a year, and for the first time I felt safe. My mother, predictably, didn't approve. "He's just a high school teacher, Jessica. Is that really the kind of ambition you want in a partner?" But I held firm, protecting my relationship from her criticism. David and I got engaged on our second anniversary, and I called my parents with the news, bracing myself for my mother's response. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I suppose settling down is probably the best option for you at this point." I swallowed my hurt, as I always did, and focused on planning a small, intimate wedding. David and I agreed that we wanted something simple, just close friends and family at a charming venue upstate. My mother, however, had other ideas. "A Morgan doesn't have a small wedding, Jessica," my mother declared when she swept into my apartment unannounced one Saturday morning, armed with bridal magazines and a list of five-star venues. "We have a reputation to maintain." What followed was 6 months of my mother systematically dismantling every decision David and I made about our own wedding. The intimate gathering of 60 guests ballooned to over 200, most of whom were my parents' business associates and social connections I barely knew. The rustic upstate venue was replaced with the Grand Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. My simple, elegant dress was vetoed in favor of a designer gown that cost more than my annual salary, which my mother reminded me she was paying for, so I should be grateful. David watched with growing concern as I retreated into my old patterns, becoming increasingly quiet and deferential around my mother. "This isn't your wedding anymore, Jess," he said gently one night. "It's your mother's event, and we're just props." He was right, but I couldn't find the courage to confront her. Years of conditioning had taught me that challenging my mother only led to emotional punishment. So I smiled through dress fittings and cake tastings, nodding as my mother made decisions about my special day without consulting me. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received a call from the wedding planner confirming the change to my vows. "Your mother sent over the revised version," she explained. "She thought the originals you wrote were a bit unconventional." Something inside me went very still. The vows I had written for David had come from the deepest part of my heart, words I had carefully chosen to express my love and commitment to him. And my mother had changed them without even telling me. When I confronted her, her response was dismissive. "Those vows were embarrassingly personal, Jessica. Wedding vows should be dignified, not some emotional outpouring that makes guests uncomfortable." "But they're my vows, Mom. For my wedding." "A wedding that I'm paying for," she reminded me sharply. "Besides, I've always had better judgment than you about these things. You should be thanking me for saving you from making a spectacle of yourself." That night, I showed David the revised vows, generic, impersonal platitudes that could have been said by anyone to anyone. "These aren't my words," I said, tears streaming down my face. "This isn't our wedding. I don't even recognize it anymore." David held me as I cried, then said something that changed everything. "We don't have to do this, Jess. Not like this. We could postpone, do it our way later. Or we could elope, just us, somewhere beautiful, exchanging the vows we wrote for each other." The thought was terrifying and exhilarating. Cancel the elaborate wedding? Defy my mother's carefully orchestrated plans? I couldn't even imagine her reaction. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't go through with the wedding as it stood. It wasn't a celebration of our love, it was a performance for my mother's social circle. I didn't want to start my marriage with one more surrender to her control. 2 days later, David and I sat my parents down in their immaculate living room. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady as I told them we were postponing the wedding. My mother's face went white, then flushed with anger. "Postponing? After everything we've done? Do you have any idea how humiliating this will be? How much money we've already spent? This is so typically selfish of you, Jessica." "We'll pay you back," David said firmly. My mother laughed, a cold, cutting sound. On a teacher's salary and whatever Jessica makes playing with books all day? Don't be ridiculous. Eleanor, my father interjected, speaking up for perhaps the first time in my memory. Maybe we should listen to what they want. Stay out of this, James, she snapped. This is between me and my ungrateful daughter. I took a deep breath. Mom, I appreciate everything you've done, but this wedding doesn't reflect who David and I are or what we want for our marriage. We need to do this our way. Your way? She practically spat the words. Your way would be some shabby little ceremony that embarrasses the family. Everything I've done has been to give you the kind of wedding someone of your limitations would never be able to have otherwise. The room went silent. David's hand tightened around mine. What do you mean by my limitations? I asked quietly. My mother waved her hand dismissively. Let's be honest, Jessica. You've never had the social grace or natural poise that these occasions require. You've always needed my guidance to avoid embarrassing yourself. That's why I've had to take control of this wedding, because left to your own devices, it would be a disaster, just like most things you attempt on your own. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I saw with perfect clarity the dynamic that had defined my relationship with my mother my entire life. She didn't see me as a person with my own desires and capabilities, she saw me as a flawed extension of herself that needed constant correction. We're not postponing the wedding, I said, my voice stronger now. We're canceling it. David and I will get married our way, without your input or your money. My mother stood up, her composure finally cracking. If you do this, don't expect any support from us. Not financially, not emotionally. You want to make your own decisions? Fine. Deal with the consequences on your own. I've been dealing with the consequences of your decisions my whole life, I replied. I think it's time I experienced the consequences of my own. We left that day with my mother's angry words following us out the door. I was shaking but also experiencing a strange sense of liberation. For the first time, I had directly opposed her will and walked away intact. The aftermath of our decision was exactly as turbulent as I'd expected. My mother launched a campaign of emotional manipulation that would have impressed Machiavelli. First came the tearful phone calls to relatives, painting herself as the victim of her daughter's cruelty. Then the guilt-laden emails about the embarrassment I'd caused the family. Finally, the cold silence when neither tactic worked. My father called once, his voice hesitant. Your mother is taking this hard, Jessica. Maybe if you apologized. For what, Dad? For wanting my own wedding to reflect my own relationship? He sighed. You know how she is. She just wants what's best for you. No, I said firmly. She wants what's best for her image of me. There's a difference. To my surprise, he didn't argue. She loves you, in her way, was all he said before hanging up. David and I were married 3 months later in a sunrise ceremony on a beach in Maine, surrounded by 20 of our closest friends. I wore a simple white dress that made me feel beautiful, not a showpiece. We exchanged the vows we had written ourselves, words that brought tears to everyone's eyes. My brother Michael came, defying our mother's boycott, and stood beside me in place of my absent father. She'll come around, Michael said at the reception, though he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. I don't think so. Not unless I go back to playing by her rules. The next 2 years were the happiest of my life, despite the family rift. David and I settled into our careers, he was now department head at his school, and I had been promoted to senior editor at the publishing house. We bought a small but charming apartment in Brooklyn and created a home that felt warm and welcoming. We talked about starting a family, though we were in no rush. The distance from my mother allowed me to flourish in ways I hadn't known were possible. I no longer heard her critical voice in my head whenever I made a decision. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. In therapy, I began to understand the depth of the emotional abuse I'd experienced and how it had shaped me. Michael visited occasionally, bringing news from home. My mother never mentioned me, he reported, as though I had ceased to exist. My father seemed more withdrawn than ever. The family portraits on the mantel had been rearranged to exclude any that featured me prominently. It's like being erased, I told David one night after Michael's visit. Part of me is hurt, and part of me is relieved. You can't be erased, David said, pulling me close. You're too real, too vibrant. She can pretend all she wants, but you exist, magnificently. The fragile peace was disrupted when my father had a minor heart attack. Michael called me from the hospital, his voice urgent. He's going to be fine, but you should come. He's been asking for you. I hesitated, knowing who else would be at the hospital. Does Mom know you're calling me? No, Michael admitted. But Jess, this is Dad. Whatever's happened between you and Mom, he loves you. I booked a flight for the next morning, my stomach in knots. David offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I needed to face alone. I'll be fine, I told him, wishing I felt as confident as I sounded. The hospital corridor seemed endless as I walked toward my father's room. I could hear my mother's voice before I saw her, giving crisp instructions to what sounded like a nurse. Some things never changed. I paused outside the door, gathering my courage, then stepped into the room. My father lay in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen him. My mother stood at his bedside, her back to me. Michael sat in a chair by the window, relief washing over his face when he saw me. Jessica's here, he announced. My mother turned, her face registering shock before settling into a mask of cold civility. Well, this is unexpected. My father's eyes opened, and a weak smile spread across his face. Jessie, he said, using the nickname he'd called me as a child, the one my mother had always disliked. You came. I moved to his bedside, opposite my mother, and took his hand. Of course I came, Dad. I'll give you some time, my mother said stiffly, walking past me without a glance. Michael followed her out, squeezing my shoulder as he passed. Alone with my father, I felt the weight of 2 years of silence. How are you feeling? I asked, searching his face. Like an old man who's been ignoring his doctor's advice about cholesterol, he said with a wry smile. But better, now that you're here. His hand tightened around mine. I've missed you, Jessie. Something broke open inside me. I've missed you too, Dad. I should have called. I should have. He trailed off, looking away. I've never been very good at standing up to your mother. It's okay, I said automatically, then caught myself. No, it's not okay. But I understand. He nodded, seeming to age before my eyes. She doesn't mean to be cruel, you know. She has these ideas about how things should be. When they aren't, she doesn't know how to handle it. I'd heard this justification all my life. For the first time, I didn't accept it. Dad, she called me a burden. She's been calling me a burden my whole life. That's not about having ideas about how things should be. That's about not seeing me as a person worthy of respect. He was quiet for a long moment. I should have protected you better, he finally said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry, Jessie. So sorry. In that moment, I realized something profound. My father was apologizing not just for the estrangement of the past 2 years, but for my entire childhood. For every time he'd stood by while my mother tore me down. For his silence. For his absence. I forgive you, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. But things can't go back to the way they were. I can't be that person anymore, Dad. I don't want you to be, he said. The woman you've become, strong enough to stand up for herself, that's who I always hoped you'd be. The days following my father's heart attack brought an uneasy truce to our family. I visited the hospital daily, carefully timing my arrivals to minimize encounters with my mother. When we did cross paths, we maintained a frigid politeness for my father's sake. Michael acted as buffer and mediator, his easy charm smoothing over the awkward silences. On the third day, as I was leaving the hospital, my father asked me to retrieve something from his home office. "There's a blue folder in the bottom drawer of my desk," he explained. "I need the insurance documents inside." I hesitated, not eager to enter my childhood home, especially if my mother might be there. But my father's pleading look broke my resolve. "Just use your old key," he said. "Your mother has a charity luncheon today. The house should be empty." With a sense of trepidation, I drove to the colonial house where I'd grown up. Standing on the porch, key in hand, I felt like an intruder rather than a daughter returning home. The house was silent as I entered, the familiar scent of my mother's preferred potpourri hanging in the air. I moved quickly to my father's office, wanting to complete my errand before my mother returned. The blue folder was exactly where he'd described, but as I pulled it from the drawer, another folder fell to the floor, its contents spilling across the carpet. As I gathered the scattered papers, a familiar name caught my eye: Jessica Eleanor Morgan, my full name, on what appeared to be medical documents. Curious, I examined the papers more closely. They were from a neurological clinic, dated when I was just 5 years old. I'd never known about any neurological issues in my childhood. As I read further, my hands began to shake. The documents detailed a series of tests and evaluations, culminating in a diagnosis I'd never heard before: mild dyslexia and attention deficit disorder. There were treatment recommendations, suggestions for educational accommodations, even a letter to my elementary school explaining my needs. But I had never received any accommodations. No teacher had ever mentioned these conditions to me. My struggles with reading and focus had always been framed by my mother as laziness or lack of effort. I sat heavily in my father's chair, my mind racing. Why had this diagnosis been kept from me? Why had I been pushed twice as hard instead of given the support I needed? The last page of the file was a letter from my mother to the clinic, thanking them for their assessment but declining their recommended treatment plan. "We prefer to address these issues through traditional methods and discipline," she had written. "I don't want my daughter labeled or treated as if she has a disability." The implications were staggering. All those years of struggling to meet impossible standards, of feeling stupid and inadequate when I couldn't focus or needed extra time with reading assignments, I hadn't been failing. I'd been working with undiagnosed learning differences that my mother had deliberately concealed. I was still sitting there, surrounded by the scattered papers, when I heard the front door open. Quickly, I stuffed the medical documents into my bag along with the insurance folder my father had requested. But I wasn't fast enough. My mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes narrowing at the sight of me behind my father's desk. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Going through your father's private papers?" I stood up, clutching my bag. "Dad asked me to get his insurance documents." "He could have asked me to bring them," she said, her tone accusatory. "There was no need for you to come here." Something inside me hardened. After what I'd just discovered, her attempt to make me feel unwelcome in my childhood home seemed almost laughable. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "Tell you what?" she replied, but a flicker of something, alarm, guilt, crossed her face. "That I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD when I was 5. That there were recommendations to help me, accommodations that would have made school less of a daily torment for me." The color drained from her face. "You were snooping through my private medical records?" "They're not your records, Mom. They're mine. And you had no right to hide them from me." She straightened, regaining her composure. "I did what any good mother would do. I protected you from being labeled unlimited." If I'd followed those doctors' advice, you'd have been tracked into remedial classes, treated as less capable than you were. Instead, I pushed you to overcome those challenges. You didn't push me to overcome them, I said, my voice rising. You punished me for having them. You called me lazy and stupid when I was working twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How it felt to never understand why I couldn't meet your expectations no matter how hard I tried. I had high expectations because I knew what you were capable of, she shot back. And I was right. Look at you, Princeton graduate, successful career. If I'd coddled you, let you use those conditions as an excuse. They weren't excuses. I was shouting now, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. They were explanations. They would have helped me understand why I was struggling. They would have given me tools to work with my brain instead of constantly fighting against it. My mother's face hardened. I see your flair for dramatics hasn't diminished. This is exactly why I didn't tell you. I knew you'd use it as a crutch, a reason to do less rather than more. I stared at her, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time. This wasn't about protection or pushing me to excel. This was about her image, her unwillingness to have a child who didn't fit her perfect vision of what a daughter should be. You know what the worst part is? I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. I actually believed you. I believed I was a disappointment, a burden, someone who just couldn't measure up. But the truth is, I was exactly like every other child with undiagnosed learning differences, struggling in silence while the adults who should have advocated for me failed me completely. My mother flinched at the word burden, but quickly recovered. Is that what this is about? You're still upset about what I said at that dinner? It was just a phrase, Jessica. You've always been so sensitive. It wasn't just a phrase. It was the culmination of a lifetime of messages that I wasn't good enough, that my existence was somehow an inconvenience to you. She shook her head dismissively. If that's how you choose to interpret a mother's guidance and discipline, I can't stop you. But I will not apologize for raising you to be resilient and ambitious instead of letting you hide behind a diagnosis. As I looked at her, immaculately dressed, chin raised in defiance, utterly convinced of her own righteousness, I realized that nothing I could say would ever make her understand the damage she had done. She would never acknowledge that her guidance had been emotional abuse, that her discipline had been cruel and unnecessary. I need to get these documents to Dad, I said finally, moving toward the door. She stepped aside, but as I passed, she said, Jessica. This changes nothing. You're still my daughter, and I still want what's best for you. I stopped and looked her directly in the eyes. That's the thing, Mom. You've never wanted what's best for me. You've wanted what's best for your idea of me. There's a difference. I left the house with my heart pounding but my steps lighter than they had been in years. The truth I had discovered was painful, but it was also freeing. For the first time I understood that the problem had never been me. It had been her inability to see and accept me as I was. Before I continue with what happened next, I want to take a moment to connect with all of you who might have experienced similar family struggles. This turning point in my story was so emotional for me, and I know many of you can relate to discovering hard truths about your families. If you're finding value in this story so far, please hit that like button to let me know. I'd also love to hear in the comments if you've ever had a moment of clarity that changed how you viewed your family dynamics. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now would be a perfect time to join our community of story sharing. I'll be right back with the fallout from this shocking discovery. Armed with the medical records and a newfound clarity about my childhood, I returned to the hospital. My father was alone in his room, looking tired but better than the day before. I handed him the insurance folder, then placed the medical documents on his bed. Why didn't you tell me, Dad? I asked quietly. He stared at the papers, recognition and then resignation washing over his face. How did you find these? They fell out when I was getting your folder. But that's not an answer. He sighed heavily, looking suddenly much older than his 68 years. Your mother was convinced it would hold you back. She had a cousin with learning disabilities who was treated poorly in school, separated from the other children. She was terrified that would happen to you. So instead, she decided to pretend there was nothing wrong with me? To push me twice as hard and make me feel like a failure when I couldn't keep up? My father couldn't meet my eyes. I wanted to tell you when you got older. I brought it up several times, especially when you were struggling in high school. But your mother was adamant. She thought she was protecting you. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting herself from having to acknowledge that I wasn't the perfect daughter she wanted. I took a deep breath. Did you ever consider what it was doing to me? Did you ever think about standing up to her, for my sake? His silence was answer enough. I deserved better, I said, my voice breaking slightly. From both of you. Before he could respond, the door opened and my mother entered, followed by Michael. They both froze at the scene before them, my father looking guilty, me standing with tears in my eyes, the medical records spread across the bed. What's going on? Michael asked, looking between us. My mother's eyes fixed on the papers. I see you've decided to air our private family matters, she said coldly. They're not private family matters, I replied. They're my medical records, which were deliberately kept from me. Records that explain why school was so hard for me, why I always felt like I was swimming upstream while everyone else just floated along. Michael stepped forward, confused. What medical records? I turned to my brother. When I was 5, I was diagnosed with dyslexia and ADHD. Mom decided not to tell me or get me any help. Instead, she pushed me harder and made me feel like a failure when I couldn't meet impossible standards. Michael's head whipped toward our mother. Is this true? It's more complicated than she's making it sound, my mother began, but Michael cut her off. Yes or no, Mom? Did you hide her diagnosis? The room fell silent as my mother's composure finally cracked. Fine. Yes, I chose not to focus on those so-called conditions. And look at the result. Jessica graduated from Princeton, has a successful career. Would that have happened if I'd let her use these diagnoses as an excuse? We'll never know, I said quietly. Because I wasn't given the choice. I wasn't given the tools that might have helped me. Instead, I spent my childhood thinking there was something fundamentally wrong with me, that I wasn't trying hard enough, that I was, what was it you always called me, a burden. Michael's expression darkened. You called her a burden? I never, my mother began, but my father interrupted. You did, Eleanor. Many times. I heard you. The betrayal on my mother's face at my father's words would have been satisfying if the whole situation weren't so painful. She turned to Michael, clearly expecting him to take her side as he always had. But my brother was looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. All those years, he said slowly, I thought Jess was just being dramatic when she said you were harder on her than me. I thought she was exaggerating. He shook his head. But she wasn't, was she? You really did treat her differently. Of course I treated her differently, my mother snapped. She needed a firmer hand. She was always so willful, so resistant to guidance. To control, you mean, I corrected. I wasn't resistant to guidance. I was resistant to being molded into someone I wasn't meant to be. My mother's face flushed with anger. You have no idea the sacrifices I made for you, the opportunities one created. And this is the thanks I get? Being ambushed in a hospital room, painted as some kind of monster? No one is calling you a monster, my father said wearily. But we can't deny that mistakes were made, Eleanor. Serious ones. The only mistake was thinking my family would support me instead of turning on me the moment things got difficult, she retorted, gathering her purse. I need some air. When you're all done vilifying me, perhaps we can return to focusing on your father's health. She swept from the room, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. I had no idea, Michael said after a moment, his voice subdued. Jess, I'm so sorry. If I'd known. You didn't, I said, reaching for his hand. She made sure of that. My father cleared his throat. I owe you an apology too, Jessie. A lifetime of them, really. I should have protected you better. I nodded, accepting his words but not yet ready to absolve him completely. The revelation had opened old wounds, bringing to the surface years of pain and confusion. But it had also validated what I'd felt all along, that the standards set for me had been unfair and impossible to meet. What happens now? Michael asked, looking between my father and me. Now, I said, gathering the medical documents, I take these to my therapist and start processing what they mean for me. As for this family. I hesitated. I don't know. That depends on whether Mom is willing to acknowledge what she did and work to repair the damage. My father nodded slowly. She'll need time. This isn't easy for her to face. It wasn't easy for me to live through it, I countered. But I'm willing to try if she is. That evening, I called David from my hotel room and told him everything. His anger on my behalf was palpable even through the phone. I always knew your mother was controlling, he said, but this is beyond that. This was deliberately harmful, Jess. I know, I replied, exhausted from the day's emotional roller coaster. The question is, where do we go from here? That's up to you, he said gently. But whatever you decide, I'm with you every step of the way. His unconditional support brought fresh tears to my eyes. I love you, I whispered. I love you too. More than anything. The next morning, I arrived at the hospital to find my mother already in my father's room. She looked like she hadn't slept, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. She glanced up when I entered but quickly looked away. How are you feeling, Dad? I asked, moving to his bedside. Better every day, he replied with a weak smile. The doctor says I might be able to go home tomorrow. That's wonderful news. I hesitated, then added, I can stay a few more days to help out, if needed. Your father will have home health care, my mother interjected stiffly. You don't need to disrupt your life. I bit back a sharp retort, reminding myself that hostility wouldn't help the situation. It wouldn't be a disruption. I want to help. My mother finally met my eyes. Why? After everything you said yesterday, why would you want to help? Because despite everything, you're still my family, I said simply. And I'm trying to break the cycle, not perpetuate it. Something flickered across her face, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of shame. Before she could respond, Michael arrived, bringing coffee for everyone. The conversation shifted to safer topics, my father's recovery, Michael's work, the weather. But the tension remained, a palpable thing hovering between my mother and me. As we were leaving that afternoon, my mother unexpectedly asked if I would drive her home. I agreed, though my stomach knotted at the prospect of being alone with her. We rode in silence for several minutes before she spoke. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, she began cautiously. About the diagnosis. I kept my eyes on the road, not trusting myself to look at her. And? I still believe I did what I thought was best at the time, she said, her voice measured. But I'm beginning to understand that what I thought was best may have caused you pain. That wasn't my intention. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd ever received from her. Intentions matter, I conceded. But so do impacts. And the impact of your decision was that I spent my entire childhood feeling fundamentally flawed. She was quiet for a long moment. I never wanted you to feel that way, Jessica. I wanted you to feel capable. Strong. But I wasn't allowed to be strong in my own way, I said softly. I had to be strong in yours. The days following my father's return home established a new, fragile dynamic in our family. My mother and I maintained a careful distance, but the open hostility had subsided. I extended my stay, helping with my father's care despite my mother's insistence that it wasn't necessary. Michael visited daily, bringing a levity that eased some of the tension. One evening, as I was organizing my father's medications in the kitchen, my mother entered holding a dusty photo album I'd never seen before. I found this while looking for your father's reading glasses, she said, placing it on the counter between us. I thought you might want to see it. Curious, I opened the album. The first page showed a little girl, unmistakably me at about 6 years old, sitting at a desk covered with papers and books, my face a study in concentration. You were working on a reading assignment, my mother explained, her voice unusually soft. It had taken you all afternoon to get through 2 pages. I turned to the next photo, the same scene, but now I was crying, my small hands balled into fists. What happened? I asked, not remembering this specific moment but recognizing the frustration on my young face. You couldn't understand why it was so hard for you when your classmates found it easy. She hesitated. It was the day after we received your diagnosis. I took these pictures because I wanted to document. I don't know, the before and after, I suppose. I thought once we implemented the strategies the doctors suggested, I could look back and see how far you'd come. I stared at her, processing this revelation. But you didn't implement those strategies. You decided against the entire treatment plan. Yes. She looked down at the photo album rather than at me. After I took these pictures, your father and I had a terrible argument. He wanted to follow the doctor's advice. I was afraid. Afraid of what? She smoothed her hand over the plastic-covered page. My cousin Thomas was diagnosed with learning disabilities when we were children. The schools back then didn't know how to handle it. They put him in special classes, separated from the other children. The other kids called him stupid. Retarded. He grew up believing he was worthless. I hadn't known about this cousin. My mother rarely spoke about her childhood. That's awful. But it was a different time, Mom. My diagnosis didn't have to define me that way. I know that now, she admitted. But then, all I could see was Thomas's face when he came home from school every day, defeated. I couldn't bear the thought of you experiencing that. So I decided we would handle it ourselves, privately. By pretending there was nothing wrong with me? She winced at my phrasing. By setting high expectations and providing structure. I thought if I pushed you hard enough, you would overcome the challenges without having to be labeled. But I was labeled anyway, I pointed out. Just not officially. I was the difficult child. The one who had to be constantly corrected. The burden. She flinched visibly at the last word. I never meant for you to feel that way. I truly thought I was helping you. I turned another page in the album. More photos of me as a child, always studying, always with that same look of intense concentration and frustration. The visual evidence of my struggles was stark and undeniable. Did it ever occur to you, I asked carefully, that your approach wasn't working? That maybe I needed something different than what you were giving me? She didn't answer immediately, her fingers tracing the outline of one of the photos. There was one night, she finally said. You were about 12. I found you crying in your room at midnight because you couldn't finish a reading assignment. You told me your brain felt broken. Her voice caught. I almost told you then. I almost showed you these reports and said it wasn't your fault, that your brain just worked differently. But I was afraid it would become an excuse, that you would stop trying so hard. Or maybe I would have finally understood why I was struggling, I suggested. Maybe I would have developed strategies that actually worked for my brain instead of constantly fighting against it. Perhaps, she conceded. I'll never know if I made the right choice. But Jessica. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. I never thought you were a burden. That word, it slipped out in a moment of anger. It was cruel and untrue, and I regret it more than you can imagine. I wanted to believe her, but decades of criticism weren't erased by one moment of vulnerability. It wasn't just that one time, though. You've made me feel like a disappointment my entire life. Because I saw how capable you were, she insisted. I saw you overcome obstacles that would have defeated most children. You were never a disappointment to me, Jessica. I was proud of you, in my way. I just didn't know how to show it without feeling like I was encouraging you to settle for less than your potential. It was a complicated admission, tangled with justifications and her own unresolved issues. But it was also the most honest conversation we'd ever had. I need to show you something else, she said, rising from her chair. She disappeared into my father's study and returned with a large manila envelope. Your father doesn't know I kept these. Inside were dozens of articles I'd written over the years, everything from my college newspaper columns to features in the literary magazine I occasionally contributed to. Each one had been carefully clipped and preserved. You saved my writing? I asked, astonished. Of course I did. She looked almost offended. You're my daughter. But you always acted like my career choice was a disappointment. She sighed. I worried about your financial security. Publishing isn't exactly known for its stability. But your writing itself. She touched one of the articles. You have a gift, Jessica. I've always thought so, even when I questioned your career path. I sat back, trying to reconcile this new information with the mother I'd always known. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I don't know, she admitted. Pride, perhaps. Fear of admitting I might have been wrong. Or maybe I just don't know how to express these things without feeling like I'm losing control. The revelation that my mother had privately cherished my work while publicly criticizing my choices was disorienting. It suggested a depth and complexity to her feelings that I'd never allowed for in my understanding of her. I think, I said slowly, that we've both been operating with incomplete pictures of each other for a very long time. She nodded, a hint of sadness in her eyes. I never meant to hurt you, Jessica. Everything I did, even the mistakes, came from wanting the best for you. I believe that, I said, and was surprised to find it was true. But good intentions don't negate the harm. We can acknowledge both. As I helped my mother return the photo album to its shelf, I noticed a small, leather-bound journal tucked behind some books. Something about it seemed familiar, though I couldn't place why. What's that? I asked, pointing. My mother's hand froze halfway to the shelf. Nothing important. Just an old diary. But her reaction suggested otherwise. Without asking permission, I reached past her and pulled out the journal. The moment I held it, recognition flooded through me. This is mine. From high school. Jessica, please. I flipped it open, confirming my suspicion. Pages of my teenage handwriting stared back at me, my most private thoughts and feelings from one of the most difficult periods of my life. You read my diary? You kept it all these years? My mother's face was pale. I found it when I was cleaning your room after you left for college. And instead of respecting my privacy, you read it? And then hid it from me? I was incredulous, the small steps of progress we'd made suddenly feeling meaningless in the face of this violation. I was worried about you, she said defensively. You were so withdrawn your senior year. I wanted to understand what was happening with you. I flipped through the pages, memories rushing back as I glimpsed entries about my struggles with anxiety, my doubts about my future, my desperate desire to escape my mother's expectations. And then I saw it, an entry from April of my senior year, just after my acceptance to Princeton. Mom found my application to the creative writing program at NYU today. I'd been keeping it secret, hoping against hope that I'd get in and finally be able to pursue what I really love. She tore it up in front of me. Said no daughter of hers would waste her potential on something so impractical. I got into Princeton pre-med, so that's where I'm going. End of discussion. Sometimes I wonder if she'd prefer a different daughter altogether, one who fits her vision more easily. I looked up from the diary, a new understanding dawning. I applied to NYU's writing program? I don't remember that. My mother's expression was a mixture of guilt and defiance. It was a phase. You weren't thinking clearly about your future. So you destroyed my application and then what, convinced me it had never happened? The magnitude of the manipulation was staggering. How many other decisions did you make for me without my knowledge? How many times did you redirect my life to fit your vision? I was protecting you from impulsive choices that would have limited your options, she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. No, I said, clutching the diary. You were controlling me. This goes beyond pushing me to succeed or hiding a diagnosis. You actively prevented me from making my own choices. She didn't deny it, which was perhaps the most damning response she could have given. I need some air, I said, heading for the door with the diary still in my hand. My mother didn't try to stop me. Outside, the cool evening air helped clear my head. I sat on the porch swing, the same one I'd spent countless hours on as a teenager, and began to read through my long-forgotten diary. With each page, the extent of my mother's manipulation became clearer. There were references to summer writing programs I'd wanted to attend but mysteriously never heard back from. Mentions of career counseling sessions at school that had somehow always emphasized medical professions over creative ones. A pattern of misdirection so subtle that I hadn't recognized it for what it was. I was still sitting there an hour later when Michael found me. Mom said you might need someone to talk to, he explained, settling beside me on the swing. What happened? I handed him the diary. Read page 47. He did, his expression growing incredulous. She sabotaged your NYU application? And you didn't remember? It's like it was erased from my memory, I said, still trying to process the revelation. There are so many things in here that I wrote about but somehow forgot. It's like I rewrote my own history to fit the narrative she created. Michael was silent for a moment, gently pushing the swing with his foot. Do you remember my junior year of high school when I suddenly stopped talking about architecture and decided to go into finance instead? I nodded, not seeing the connection. I didn't just change my mind, he said quietly. Mom sat me down one weekend when you were at debate camp and explained why architecture was a dead-end career. How I'd never make enough money to support a family. How Dad's connections in finance would give me advantages I'd be foolish to reject. He stared out at the darkening yard. I believed her. I let her redirect my entire life. You could have gone back to architecture after college, I pointed out. It wasn't too late. By then, I'd convinced myself it was what I wanted. That she'd been right all along. He turned to me, his expression serious. That's the thing about Mom's manipulation, it's so thorough that eventually you internalize it. You forget it wasn't your choice to begin with. The realization that Michael had experienced a similar pattern was both validating and heartbreaking. Our mother's control had shaped both our lives in ways we were only beginning to understand. What do we do with this? I asked, gesturing to the diary. Confront her again? Try to untangle all the ways she's influenced our choices? Michael considered the question. I think we acknowledge what happened without letting it define us going forward. We can't change the past, but we can make our own choices now. His pragmatism was reassuring, a counterbalance to my swirling emotions. I'm not sure I can forgive this, I admitted. The diagnosis was one thing, misguided protection. But this was deliberate manipulation of my future. I'm not saying you have to forgive her, Michael replied. I'm saying you don't have to let it control you anymore. You're a successful editor now. You write. You've built a life you love with David. Maybe it wasn't the path you would have chosen at 18, but it's yours now. He was right, I realized. While I mourned the choices that had been taken from me, I couldn't deny that I had found my way to a fulfilling life despite my mother's interference. Perhaps that was its own form of victory. The final day of my stay in Connecticut dawned clear and cold. My father was recovering well, already complaining about the restrictions on his diet and activity. My mother had maintained a careful distance since the discovery of the diary, as if sensing that she had crossed a line from which there might be no return. David was arriving that afternoon to drive home with me, a prospect that filled me with relief. I needed his steady presence, his unwavering support as I processed everything I'd learned. As I was packing my suitcase, there was a soft knock at the guest room door. My mother stood in the hallway, looking more hesitant than I'd ever seen her. "May I come in?" she asked. I nodded, continuing to fold my clothes with methodical precision. "I've been thinking about what to say to you," she began, perching on the edge of the bed. "How to explain my actions over the years. But there's no explanation that would be adequate, is there?" I paused my packing. "Probably not." She nodded, accepting this. "Then perhaps all I can offer is acknowledgement. I made choices for you that weren't mine to make. I interfered in ways that altered the course of your life. I believed I was doing what was best, but I robbed you of agency in the process." She took a deep breath. "And for that, I am truly sorry." The apology, so long awaited, should have felt momentous. Instead, it felt almost anticlimactic, a few simple words that couldn't possibly address decades of damage. "I appreciate you saying that," I said carefully. "But I'm not sure where we go from here." "Neither am I," she admitted. "But I want you to know that I've been doing a lot of reflecting since you found the diary. About why I felt so compelled to control you and your brother. About what I was really afraid of." "And what did you conclude?" I asked, genuinely curious. She twisted her wedding ring, a nervous gesture I'd rarely seen from her. "I think I was afraid of you making the same mistakes I did." "What mistakes?" "Choosing a path that didn't utilize my full potential." She looked up, her eyes meeting mine. "Did you know I wanted to be a lawyer? That I had a scholarship to Columbia Law?" This was news to me. "What happened?" "I met your father. I fell in love." It was the 70s, and despite all the talk of women's liberation, there was still an expectation that a woman would prioritize her husband's career over her own. "So I gave up my scholarship, married your father, and became the perfect corporate wife and mother." Her voice had taken on a bitter edge. "I don't regret having you and Michael. But I do regret surrendering my ambitions so easily." I sat down across from her, absorbing this revelation. "So when you pushed me so hard, when you redirected me from writing to medicine, I was trying to ensure you wouldn't make the same sacrifice," she finished. "I wanted you to have the career I didn't pursue, to achieve what I couldn't." "But that was your dream, not mine," I pointed out. "You were still deciding what my life should look like, just based on your regrets instead of your aspirations." "Yes," she agreed quietly. "I see that now. I was so focused on giving you what I thought I had missed that I didn't consider you might want something different entirely." The irony was painful. In her determination to prevent me from repeating her mistakes, she had pushed me to make different ones, pursuing paths that weren't true to who I was, just as she had done. "It's not too late, you know," I said after a moment. "For you, I mean. People go to law school in their 60s all the time." She laughed, a surprised, genuine sound I rarely heard from her. "I haven't thought about that in years." I'm not sure it's what I want anymore. But that's the point, isn't it? You get to decide. Just like I should have been able to decide about NYU, or pre-med, or any of the other choices you made for me. She nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose it is. She reached out hesitantly and placed her hand over mine. I won't ask for your forgiveness, Jessica. I know I haven't earned it. But I am asking for a chance to do better. To know the daughter you actually are, not the one I tried to shape you into. It was more self-awareness than I'd ever heard from my mother, more humility than I'd thought her capable of. I didn't know if it was enough to rebuild our relationship, but it was a start. I'd like that, I said finally. It won't be easy. There's a lot of history between us. I know, she agreed. But I'm willing to try if you are. When David arrived that afternoon, I introduced him to my parents with a new sense of cautious optimism. My mother made a visible effort to engage with him, asking about his teaching and actually listening to his responses. My father, still weak but improving, shook David's hand and said how glad he was to finally meet the man who made his daughter happy. As we prepared to leave, my mother handed me a small package. Something I want you to have, she explained. I unwrapped it to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, similar to the one from my teenage years but new. Inside the cover, she had written, "For all the stories you have yet to tell. With love, Mom." It was a small gesture, but a meaningful one, an acknowledgement of the writer I had always been, the passion she had tried to redirect. I thanked her sincerely. The drive back to New York was long, giving David and me plenty of time to talk. I told him everything, about the hidden diagnosis, the manipulated college decisions, my mother's revelations about her own abandoned dreams. So where does this leave things with your family? He asked as we crossed from Connecticut into New York. In progress, I replied after some thought. My mother and I have a lot of work to do, a lot of patterns to break. But for the first time, I feel like she's actually seeing me. And I'm seeing her more clearly too. And your father? He was complicit in his silence, I acknowledged. But I think he genuinely regrets not protecting me better. We'll work on that too. David reached across the console to take my hand. I'm proud of you, you know. Standing up for yourself, confronting decades of manipulation, that takes incredible strength. His words warmed me. It's easier when you have someone in your corner who believes in you. 3 months later, I found myself sitting across from my mother at a small cafe in Manhattan. It was our third lunch since my visit, part of our cautious efforts to rebuild our relationship. Each meeting had been slightly less awkward than the last, though we were still finding our way. I'd been thinking about what you said, my mother began after we ordered. About it not being too late to pursue what I want. Oh? I was intrigued. I've enrolled in a paralegal certification program, she said, a hint of pride in her voice. It's not law school, but it's connected to the field I was once passionate about. The local legal aid clinic has a program for senior volunteers once I'm certified. Mom, that's wonderful. I was genuinely pleased for her. How does Dad feel about it? Supportive, surprisingly. I think his health scare made him realize we shouldn't put off the things that matter to us. She hesitated, then added, he also suggested I should consider therapy. To work through some of my controlling tendencies. I nearly choked on my water. Dad suggested therapy? She smiled wryly. I had a similar reaction. But yes, he did. And I'm considering it. The idea of my mother, who had always viewed therapy as a weakness, being open to it was yet another sign of how much had changed. I think that could be really positive, I said carefully. She nodded, then changed the subject. How's your new project coming along? The one you mentioned last time? It's going well, I replied, still adjusting to my mother's newfound interest in my writing. My editor thinks it has potential. I'd love to read it, when you're ready to share. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. As we finished our lunch and prepared to part ways, my mother hesitated, then pulled me into an unexpected hug. I'm trying, Jessica, she whispered. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm trying. I know, Mom, I replied, returning the embrace. So am I. Walking back to my office afterward, I reflected on the journey of the past few months. The wound my mother had inflicted when she called me a burden in front of everyone had led to a reckoning that was painful but necessary. By finally answering back, by refusing to accept the narrative she had constructed, I had set in motion changes that were still unfolding. Our family would never be perfect. The damage done over decades couldn't be undone in a few conversations. But there was hope now, a possibility of something healthier than what had come before. And I had discovered a strength in myself that I hadn't known existed, the strength to confront the past while refusing to let it determine my future. In the end, the most surprising outcome wasn't that I had finally stood up to my mother. It was that in doing so, I had given us both a chance at freedom, me from her expectations, and her from the regrets that had driven her to control me. It wasn't the ending I would have predicted, but perhaps it was the one we both needed. Wow, I can't believe I've shared this entire journey with you all today. This experience changed my perspective on family dynamics forever and taught me that sometimes confrontation, while painful, is necessary for healing. I'd love to know if any of you have experienced similar family karma or justice moments in your own lives. Please share in the comments below. If this story resonated with you in any way, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button to help more people find it. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel for more authentic stories about family relationships, personal growth, and finding your voice. I post new content every week. Thank you so much for staying with me through this emotional journey. Your support means everything to me. Until next time, remember that standing up for yourself isn't selfish, it's sometimes the most healing thing you can do, both for yourself and for those who have hurt you.